Welcome to the Virtual Pathfinder channel. This is a review of the Olympus 25mm f1.8 lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. We will take a closer look at all the important aspects of this lens. If you're interested in photography, lenses and camera equipment, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm interested to hear your opinion about this lens. Please write what you think about it in the comment section below. The lens in this review is a 25mm lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. It has about the same angle of view as the human eye. Those lenses are often referred to as standard lenses or normal lenses. They typically have 40 to 50mm focal length for a full-frame camera. It is neither a wide-angle lens or a portrait lens. It kind of lands in the middle between the two. Of course, it can be used for a bit wider portraits or perhaps more narrow, wide images. The wide maximum aperture allows a certain subject isolation as well as low light capability. When using the largest aperture, the background can be blurred out to some extent. The lens in this review was released several years ago. It has support for autofocus and automatic aperture control. First, I will look at the physical characteristics of this lens, then the specified optics and functionality, before moving on to various aspects of image quality. Finally, I will present my conclusions about the lens, with some comments on how to use it and what kind of photography it's good for. First, let's have a look at some sample images. Let's start with the physical characteristics of the lens. I measure the weight to be about 133 grams on my scale. According to the specifications, it's 136 grams, which is light. I found the length to be about 41 millimeters. That is compact, in line with the Micro Four Thirds philosophy. The filter thread has 46 millimeter diameter. One thing I really like about this lens, which is a bit unusual for Olympus lenses, is that the lens hood is actually included. Often the original Olympus lens hoods are not included, and they tend to be quite expensive, so that is a good thing about this lens. The lens has many plastic parts, which makes it really light. Although it feels solid, it does not give the impression of a high-end lens. There is a plastic focus ring without any scale, which I think has about the right amount of friction. It is not flimsy, but looks a bit simple. The focus ring has no stops, just direction, so it's not possible to find the near focus or infinity by looking at the focus ring. It is good that it's possible to focus manually, but it doesn't feel like a joy with this kind of focus ring. Most people will probably use autofocus most of the time, then this is not an issue. There is no aperture ring, which I think is perfectly okay. If the aperture is set manually, it's better to do it from the camera body instead of using the aperture ring. The advantage of doing that is that it's possible to see the aperture setting in the finder, especially in darkness, and it's also good to be able to do it while aiming the camera. The quality impression is good, although there are many plastic parts. The lens is not weather sealed. If you intend to use it outdoors in bad weather, then that needs to be considered. The focal length is 25 mm as previously mentioned, and that corresponds to a 50 mm lens for a full-frame camera, which makes it a standard lens. It has aperture settings between f1.8 and f22. The aperture has 7 circular diaphragm blades. The autofocus lights and highlights appear as nice circles. The closest focus is 0.24 meters. The lens has support for autofocus and aperture control from the camera, which makes it easy to take quick shots. There is no image stabilization in the lens. I use Olympus cameras, which have image stabilization in the camera body. But if you use a different camera brand, that may be good to know. The lens communicates EXIF data to the camera. In other words, the focal length and aperture setting for each shot is saved to the image files. I have shot photos of a test pattern using various apertures to check if there's vignetting or distortion in the images. The resulting images show no visible distortion. There's a slight vignetting, mainly at the largest aperture, f1.8. You can stop the video for each setting and have a look at the images and the test pattern. Vignetting can easily be corrected in post-processing. When looking at the center and the edges of the test images, it's possible to see the sharpness for the different aperture settings. Overall, I find this lens to be very sharp, even for the largest aperture f1.8. The lens loses a bit of sharpness from f8 and on, presumably due to diffraction. I find the edge sharpness good for all apertures, best for f2.8 and on. In general, this is a very sharp lens. There is no noticeable chromatic aberration in the images. Only if zoomed into pixel level there is a tiny amount of chromatic aberration. I find the contrast to be very good. The sample images give an idea about the color rendering. My impression of the color rendering is that it's slightly blue-purple tint to the images. That may have to do with the design of the anti-reflective coating. If warmer tone is needed, it's easy to adjust in post-processing. Overall, the images are very sharp and with high quality. When looking at flare in daylight, mainly when shooting against the sun, there is a very limited amount of flare. I would say it's well controlled. It may appear as small circles against the light. The good thing about this lens, as mentioned earlier, is that the lens hood is included, which reduces the flare even more. Overall, this lens handles flare well. For f1.8, the background can be blurred out, especially if the object in focus is near the camera. The autofocus lights and highlights appear as nice circles. The bokeh is smooth and looks good. The typical use for this kind of lens is low-light photography. It can handle dark environments with not too much movement in it. Certain wide portraits using the shallow depth of field. People photography with a relatively narrow angle of view. Photos with blurred out background directing the attention to the object in focus, for instance product photography. It can be used for artistic photography using the shallow depth of field. Also for architectural photography, it's possible due to the low image distortion. It can be used for action photography since it's fully automatic and has a wide maximum aperture, which allows fast shutter speed. Here are my conclusions about this lens. I summarize the positive and the negative. First, the negative. The focus ring is kind of simple. It is not weather sealed. It doesn't have image stabilization. The positive. This is a very bright lens with good low light capability. It is very sharp and has no noticeable distortion or chromatic aberration. It is fully automatic with autofocus support and support for automatic aperture setting. It can produce images with shallow depth of field. It is very compact and lightweight. The EXIF data is transferred to the camera. And finally, the lens hood is included. This lens can be used for portraits, documentary photography like photojournalism or product photography. It can also be used for artistic photography using the shallow depth of field and the low light capabilities. It can also be used for action photography since it's fully automatic, for instance sport events. This lens is not very cheap, but in relation to performance, form factor and functionality, the price-performance ratio is very good. The price in the year 2020 is about $300. There are some alternatives at 25mm focal length, and here are some of them. First, the Panasonic Lumix G25mm f1.7. That costs only $150. The weight is 125 grams. And the length is 52mm. That is a good budget alternative. Then we have the Panasonic Leica DG Summilux f1.4. That costs $700, which is more than twice as expensive as the lens in this review. It weighs 205 grams and has a length of 55mm. Finally, I can mention the Voigtlander Nocton 25mm f0.95. That cost $749. That's about 2.5 times as expensive as the lens in this review, and it weighs kind of a lot, 435 grams, and it's quite long at 70mm. But then you get f0.95. I didn't mention the Olympus M.Zuiko 25mm f1.2 Pro lens. Since it's so much more expensive than this lens, it costs almost 4 times as much, and it's also much bigger. So finally, is this lens good value for the money? My conclusion is it's good value for the money. It strikes a good balance between price, size and image quality. I hope this was useful information for you. If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe. I will soon make a review of the Tokina 300mm f6.3 mirror lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. Until then, have a nice week and stay safe.